Hi, y'all. Here we are, back again for more Chapter 20 in Landmark History of the American People. The sun is no longer boss. The page looks like this. Very exciting. In the days before the railroad, people did not worry much about being on time. George Washington or Thomas Jefferson did not consider a person late simply because he arrived 15 or 20 minutes after the time they'd agreed upon. Benjamin Franklin listed in his autobiography 13 virtues he determined to practice until he became perfect in them. He included sincerity and cleanliness, but he did not include punctuality. In colonial days, it was hard to be on time anyway because watches were expensive and not many people carried them. Most people depended on the clock they saw or heard on the town hall or the church steeple. Grandfather clocks struck the hour and the half hour to tell time to people who had no watches. If you took a trip, there was no regular timetable. Stagecoaches left whenever they had arrived from some other place or whenever the driver and the horses were ready. In a stagecoach on a good road, you might average 5 miles an hour. After the railroads came in, you could average 40, and you could travel on schedule. When trains traveling in opposite directions used a single track, the engineers had to know exactly what time the train was due from another direction. Then he could ensure he was on the siding to let the other one pass. Trains ran by the minute. And now, with trains speeding from city to city, there were strange new problems that nobody had ever noticed before. The trouble was that every town had its own clock set to its own particular time. The astronomers said that it was noon when you saw the sun reach its zenith, the highest point in the heavens. Since the earth was constantly in motion, and since the sun rose sooner when you were more to the east, then the definition of noon obviously depended on where you were. Since you saw the sun rise earlier if you were in New York than if you were in Chicago, and still earlier in Chicago than in San Francisco, the time was different in those places. There actually was a difference in the astronomical time between any two places if one was to the west of the other. When it was precisely noon, that is when the sun had reached its zenith, in Boston, it was still only 11:56 in the morning in Worcester, slightly to the west. And when it was precisely noon in Chicago, it was already 12:06 in Indianapolis, which was slightly to the east. Cities became as proud about their own time as about the splendor of their city hall or the grandeur of their hotel. In every city, the people said God had given them their own time when he fixed the sun in the heavens. Imagine what this meant for the railroad. The Pennsylvania Railroad tried to use the Philadelphia time on its eastern lines, but that was 5 minutes earlier than the New York time and 5 minutes later than the Baltimore time. In Indiana, there were 23 different local times. In Illinois, 27. In Wisconsin, 38. Even in any one town, people disagreed about what time it really was. Each jeweler might have his own special time to which his customers were loyal. To keep businesses running smoothly, and so that people would know when the stores would open and close, and when to meet their appointments, each city somehow had to announce its own time. Some used chimes on a town clock. Others blew a whistle, or used a ball called a time ball, held up on a pole in a conspicuous place, which was dropped at the precise moment of noon. Generally, the railroads used the local time for their arrival in each station. In between cities, however, there was great confusion. Yet for speeding express trains, a few minutes could make the difference between a clear track and a fatal collision. It is not surprising, then, that the railroad men were among the first to try to bring order out of this confusion. But it was not easy. If you began tampering with their time, citizens were as outraged as if you tried to change the name of their city. And of course, the astronomers really had a point. If you measured time by the sun in the heavens, then not man but nature had made the confusion, and then perhaps no one could do anything about it. But maybe, others said, this way of handling time was only a matter of habit. Suppose people simply stopped using sun time or astronomical time, and suppose that instead they used a new kind of railroad time or standard time. Suppose you managed to persuade a different city along the railroad line to set their clock to the same time, or a bunch of different cities to do that. Take, for example, the train that ran from West Boston to Worcester. Although Worcester's astronomical time was 4 minutes earlier than Boston's, perhaps the people of Worcester could be persuaded to set their clocks to the same time as those in Boston. For the United States as a whole, you could mark off on the map a few conspicuous time belts up and down the whole country. You would need only 4. Eastern Time, Central Time, Mountain Time, and Pacific Time. All right, so I want you all to jump ahead to page 133. You see that? Those are the time zone, which is why we've been learning the geography. So exciting. Okay, so you've got Pacific Time, and you see where that line goes. Mountain Time, Central Time, and there's us over there in Eastern Time, which I'm trying to see here. So you got to use the black lines. You're actually using the black lines. Not sure what the dotted line is because we're for sure with black lines now. I think, not sure. Not sure what the dotted lines are. Look at the black lines. That shows that we're in Eastern time. Actually, that's funny. That still shows us as Central time there. That's interesting. A map of the United States published sometime after the U.S. Congress adopted the Standard Time Act. Map shows local times before the railroads adopted their standard times. It also shows the time zones the railroads adopted, and finally the time zones that the U.S. Congress adopted in March of 1918. Okay, so there's a little bit of a difference there, but you can kind of see where the different 4 sections are, okay? Okay, so up and down the whole country, you could need only 4: Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. Each would be several hundred miles wide. Standard time would be exactly the same for all the places within the belt. At the end of each belt, the time would change by a whole hour. These time belts would be marked on all maps, and then everybody would know exactly what time it was everywhere. This was a sensible plan, but it took many years to persuade Americans. The leader of the campaign was William Frederick Allen, an energetic man who was not afraid to make enemies. He had seen the confusion when he had been an engineer on the Camden and Amboy Railroad before he joined the staff of the Official Guide of the Railways, and he made time reform the main purpose of his life. Allen aimed to provide a railroad timetable that everybody could understand and could rely upon. This would help make railroad travel safer and speedier. The railroads finally agreed to implement his plan for standard time, and it went into effect on noon, November 18, 1883. People everywhere prepared for the dramatic moment. At 11:45 in the morning, according to the old Chicago time, conductors and engineers gathered in the lobby of the railroad station in Chicago. With their old-fashioned stem-winding pocket watches in their hand, they looked at the clock on the wall. When the official Chicago Railroad clock chimed noon, they stopped it. The switch instantly connected it by telegraph wire to the new official clock for the entire central time belt. At what would have been 9 minutes and 32 seconds past noon by the old Chicago time, they started their clock once more. The railroad men all set their watches, and now everyone was on standard time. Some people still objected. They thought the railroads were trying to take the place of God. It's unconstitutional, warned Mayor Doug Barry of Bangor, Maine, being an attempt to change the immutable laws of God Almighty and hard on the working men by changing day into night. He told churches not to ring their bells according to the new standard time. The editor of the Indianapolis Sentinel was outraged. The sun is no longer the boss of the job. People, 55 million of them, must eat, sleep, and work as well as travel by railroad time. It is a revolt and a rebellion. The sun will be requested to rise and set by railroad time. People have to marry by railroad time and die by railroad time. Ministers will be required to preach by railroad time. Isn't that amazing how people get so upset by change when we're like, it's what they do. One minister in Tennessee was so disgusted at his effort to take the place of God's own sun time that he took a hammer into his pulpit and smashed his watch to pieces just to shock the congregation. But others found reason to be pleased. The New York Herald approved. The man who goes to church in New York on November 18th will hug himself with delight to find that the noon service has been curtailed to the extent of nearly 4 minutes, while every old maid on Beacon Hill in Boston will rejoice to discover that she is younger by almost 16 minutes. Gradually, people forgot their outrage. They discovered that it was wonderfully convenient to have standard time. One city after another changed its clocks to agree with the clock on the railroad station. In 1918, Congress finally gave the Interstate Commerce Commission the legal power to mark off time belts. The government simply followed the time belts that William Frederick Allen had persuaded the railroads to adopt 35 years earlier. Standard time helped to draw all the nation's railroad lines together, but people needed to take other steps too. In 1860, there were about 350 different railroad companies and about 30,000 miles of railroad tracks in the United States, yet there was not really a national railroad network. The main reason was that many railroad lines were not on the same gauge. The gauge is the distance between the two rails, measured from the inside of one rail to the inside of the other. There were many different gauges. Some railroad builders put their tracks 6 feet apart. Some put them closer together, and there were at least 11 different gauges in general use. A railroad car that would just fit on the 6-foot gauge would not run on the narrower gauges. If you wanted to send a package any distance by railroad, it had to be taken out of the car that fit one gauge and moved into a car to fit the gauge of the next railroad. In 1861, a package sent from Charleston, South Carolina to Philadelphia, 670 miles, had to change railroad cars 8 times. Moving a package from one railroad to another made work for porters and teamsters. At the same time, the passengers who had to wait in the town while they changed trains made business for hotels, restaurants, and shopkeepers. Naturally enough then, town boosters were not anxious to have all railroads on the same gauge, because then the people wouldn't get off on the railroad tracks and shop in their towns. From the beginning, quite a few lines happened to have the same gauge. George Stephenson, the English railroad inventor, had designed his locomotive to measure 4 foot 8.5 inches between the wheels, the usual distance between wheels on a wagon. When Stephenson locomotives were imported to the United States, they had this standard gauge, and many early railroad lines naturally built their tracks to fit the imported trains. By 1861, about half the railroad tracks in the United States were standard gauge. These were mainly the New England and the Middle Atlantic states, where most of the early railroads had been built. But the other half of the American railroad tracks were on every sort of gauge, from about 3 feet to about 6 feet. The Civil War brought an urgent need to ship arms and men quickly across the country. The Confederates hastily connected all the lines that ran into Richmond on standard gauge. Now passengers and freight could go straight through. In the North, too, the war hurried progress. For the first time, service connected both New York City with Washington, D.C. At the end of the war, Americans from the North and South saw the overwhelming advantages of a uniform gauge. And I'm going to give you a little video to help understand this a little bit, because I'm even a little bit confused. It had to do with the measurements between the wheels, I guess, is how it ran. And when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed with standard gauge in 1869, that settled the question. Now, if a railroad builder wanted to join the traffic across the continent, he had to set his rails 4 feet, 8.5 inches apart. So that's how far from this side to this side, okay, they had to be apart. Because you can't have a rail track, right, that changes, or the train is going to fall off of it. By 1880, about 4/5 of the tracks in the United States were standard gauge. Most of the other gauges were in the old Confederate South. Finally, in 1886, representatives of Southern railroads decided to change the gauge of all their 13,000 miles of tracks to the national standard. Holy cow, that would be hard. A month in advance, crews were sent along loosening the old track. They measured the distance for the new standard gauge and put spikes along the wooden ties. On May 31 and June 1 of 1886, the men worked frantically. One record-breaking crew on the Louisville-Nashville Railroad changed 11 miles of track in 4.5 hours. June 1, 1886 was a holiday along the Southern tracks. By 4 o'clock, the Southern railroads had joined the Union. Okay.